Hi everyone, welcome to the YouTube channel of Global Environmental Politics. I'm Yixian from the University of Bath and the Associate Editor of the journal JAP. Today we are delighted to have two authors to join us from two different countries to talk about their recent article published in our journal entitled The Missing Ingredients for a Polycentric Governance System of Orbital Debris. Let me now briefly introduce our guest. First, Jean-Frédéric Morin is a full professor at the Political Science Department of University Laval in Quebec City, Canada, and also inaugural director of the Interdisciplinary Research Center on Global Governance at the University of Laval. His research looks at international environmental institutions. He's also particularly interested in how institutions innovate, interact, and evolve. Second, we also have Cynthia Couette, who is a PhD candidate in political science at Laval University in Canada and also in regulation and governance at the Australian National University in Australia. Her research revolve around the role of non-state actors in the global governance of common goods, focusing on the global governance of health and space. So welcome, Jeff and Cynthia. Let's start with your research interest in global governance of outer space. So, Jeff, I'd like to know how did you get interested in these new areas? Because we often know you're an expert in the nexus of trade and environment, but this is really kind of a new research agenda that you have developed over the last few years.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, it's a kind of a new interest for me. And I agree. It might seem that I jumped to a very different topic, but in fact, I see a lot of continuity in my research program in two different ways. First, my think is really the interplay between environmental issues and non-environmental issue areas. So I did my PhD. It was on the interplay between patent governance and biodiversity. And then I got interested in health and the environment and investment in the environment and trade in the environment. So now it's space in the environment. And next it might be, cultural diversity or human rights in the environment, right? And the second continuity is that I'm interested in institutional fragmentation. And so I was looking for an issue area where there's not one core, clear, multilateral institution, but actually a lot of different institutions. In the same way that when I was working on trade in the environment, I was not paying attention to the WTO very much, but instead to several hundreds of different trade agreements. And in this case, on my work on space governance, it's basically the same. And I realized that most multilateral space agreements were concluded 50 years ago. They do not reflect the issues of the 21st century. And at the same time, there's a rapid proliferation of bilateral and regional initiatives related to space governance. So it was a good case study for me to think about institutional complexity and fragmentation.
Thank you, Jeff. And now let me ask Cynthia. So, what has led you to choose this topic as the focus of your PhD?
Well, it actually is not the topic of my PhD, which might be surprising because it's what I'm currently publishing about. But there are connections. So my PhD is actually on global health governance. But as you mentioned when you introduced me, my research interest really is located at looking at and understanding better how hybrid institutions and systems of governance are currently governing global common goods. So there's a lot of overarching questions and theoretical questions to ask that apply both in the governance of public health and the governance of space. We looked at in a previous article also on some hybrids organization in space. In my PhD, I look at the expansion of public-private partnerships in global health. So again, another type of hybrid institutions transforming more and more into like formal organizations. So it's really interesting for me, and there's a lot of overarching bridges between the two. And I was really lucky that I've been working with Jean-Frédéric for quite some years now, and I was part of different steps in that project, specifically doing some field work, if you want, remotely. I started working with him during COVID, so it was very remote initially when we did the interviews and all that. But taking part in all those steps, it became natural for us to now think of some analytical questions to investigate together based on all this data we've collected.
Great. It's really good to hear about your research. So now let's move to a question about your JEP article. So in the article, you show some nuanced findings regarding the feasibility of a polycentric system to govern orbital debris. So can you tell us what are the key barriers to an effective polycentric governance in this case? Maybe I'll start with Cynthia this time.
Yeah, well, just to put very quickly in context, as you said, we found some nuance finding in the sense that although we did find with a network analysis that the space governance system exhibited polycentric structural characteristics, we did a massive content analysis of 1,108 space arrangements, and we did not find that there was an emergence of sustainable space governance, as some would argue that a polycentric structure could do on its own. And so, more to give a bit of context, we found that almost 99% of we scored arrangements on an index that we created. We called the Governance of Debris in Space Index, a GAUS index, which basically looks at for each arrangement if they included a wide range of considerations regarding space debris. And that index scores from 0 to 1. And as I was going to say, almost 99% of them score below 0.5. And what we found that was interesting is we looked at several decades of arrangements signed in space related to space, and we did not find an increase over time. Even though there was an emergence of some really key important multilateral guidelines and frameworks, we didn't find that this proliferated in this diffuse, in all the arrangements that Jeff mentioned proliferated, the bilateral arrangements, the plurilateral arrangements that proliferated in space, that did not transition to all of those arrangements in the system. I'll let Jean-Frédéric explain a bit more.
Yeah, we found very little agreements with sustainability rules, and then we wonder why is it the case? And so we conducted a number of different interviews, more than 30 interviews. Actually, Cynthia did most of those interviews. The title of the paper is "The Missing Ingredients for a Polycentric Governance Space Debris." And so we ask interviewees, what are the missing ingredients, basically, to have a well-functioning polycentric governance? And they pointed especially to a lack of strong enforcement mechanisms to make sure that the agreed rules are that actors actually comply with the rules that they agreed upon. And so one is the lack of a monitoring system to know basically who is doing what in outer space. Second is insufficient sanction regime in one way or another for those who do not comply with the rules. And third is the lack of a strong dispute settlement mechanism to settle disagreement related to those rules. And those three different mechanisms are important missing ingredients. Because if you don't have a strong enforcement mechanisms, then actors do not see little reasons to elaborate sustainability rules if those rules are unlikely to be if actors are unlikely to comply with those rules. And some of those rules might be costly for space actors.
Thank you both. So in this case, let me just ask a follow-up question regarding how we can address these challenges. So based on the findings, so what would be your recommendations to policymakers around the world for addressing this global problem?
I think there's a role for multilateralism in a polycentric system. To me, a polycentricity does not mean a completely fragmented system, right? Ostrom herself actually insisted on the importance of some central institutions, and this is something that is sometimes lost, right, when we talk about polycentricity. And so in the case of space debris, I think strong multilateral mechanism, especially for monitoring orbital debris, and also to enforce sanctions on operators who do not comply with certain rules would significantly improve the space governance, but also provide an incentives for actors to elaborate rules, and those rules do not need necessarily to be at the multilateral rules. You know, they can be bilateral initially, they could be regional, but having some form of multilateral system within a polycentric system, I think is something that is important, and it might be an important lessons also, an important lesson for other issue areas. There's an increasing number of people who are advocating, arguing in favor of a polycentric system for climate change, and other global environmental challenges. And I think this is something important to keep in mind.
Cynthia, do you want to add some thoughts?
Well, based on what we found, I think I would just add two other things that I think would be good to keep in mind. Is the first one that comes out of our finding is really the message to policymakers is don't miss opportunities. So we found 0.6% of arrangements only mention active removal of space debris, 5.8% only include a commitment to mitigate debris, and all of those stronger commitments are only included in arrangements that are specifically about space debris. And so basically all of those other thousands of arrangements are kind of a missed opportunity to reiterate a norm, reiterate an idea, consideration for space debris, some kind of commitment. And a good example of that is that one arrangement, the only arrangement that is not specifically on space debris, that includes consideration to mitigate space debris, is the principles of space safety for the commercial satellite industry. And so it's interesting to see that there are opportunities to remind that space debris is a really core issue for space sustainability, which is essential to basically all of space activities. And so there's opportunity to reiterate and reinforce these norms in all of those arrangements. So take more opportunities. Maybe that's one of the things that comes out of the findings very clearly. And another one that's really key in polycentricity is learning. And that's where one of the tools that comes out of our project is really, really key. So we outlined a tool that we call the SAGE, which is the Space Actors and Governance Explorer. And basically you can go online and find all of the text of the arrangements that were made publicly available. We put them available online for actors to go and see what other actors have included, how they worded different provisions, how they've evolved the norms regarding space debris mitigation, how they've included that with different topics. So there's really an opportunity. We put this tool outline to be publicly available. And that's really because this is for the public good. And there's an opportunity for policymakers to use that and learn and do specifically what a polycentricity system is supposed to do.
Great. These are very important messages. I think the role of multilateralism and then how we can trigger learning. And I hope some policymakers can also watch this video and hear these messages. So now I'm super curious about your research agenda in this very new and important area. So I assume you have also some follow-up projects. Would you like to share some ongoing work with our audience?
Cynthia, do you want to go first?
Sure, maybe I can touch up there. We have a few projects on the way, so I'll just talk briefly on that. But as I mentioned initially, I affectionately call space my side quest. So it's going to be a bit shorter, but at the moment, we're working on a paper that is basically just looking at this big amount of data we've gathered on space arrangements, which is a new area of governance to see if some of the key institutional literature on institutional design apply in space governance and what's different, what are the findings. So there's one paper that we're working on that. There's another paper that Jeff is working with and someone else at the chair, Pick, where they're developing theoretical framework to see with all of this data we've gathered if there's some sequencing between binding and non-binding arrangements that seem to emerge in the creation of those arrangements. And the other project that we are currently working on with someone else at the chair, Philippe Evoy, which is we're going to be looking specifically, it's a follow-up on these two projects where we're going to see if there is a sequencing. What are the patterns of emergence of space debris considerations in space? So what we did with this paper we're talking about today is to see if it emerged or not, and looking at the governance system. But this follow-up paper is going to be looking at what emerged. What's the pathway it followed? What was the pathway of emergence against in order to provide information to policymakers for future?
And on my side, on top of that, space debris is basically the first issue that comes to mind when you think about space sustainability, but it's certainly not the only one. Space activities have other negative externalities for the environment, and so I would like to work on the impact of launching stations, for example, on biodiversity. I'm also very much interested in the damage that can be created with this tons of aluminum that is basically burning in the atmosphere when satellites re-enter the atmosphere. They're burning. All this aluminum is out there, and it might create damage to the ozone layer, for example. I'm also interested in light pollution and the importance of dark sky, not only for astronomers but also for some indigenous communities. And I already have some field work scheduled for this fall, actually, on those other sustainability issues related to space activities. Yeah.
Thank you both. These are all very interesting projects. So I really look forward to seeing more work from these studies. So to end our conversation, maybe I'll ask each of you to indicate the most important research gap in your view in this area, especially the governance of outer space. But you can also go a bit more specific. So Jeff, do you want to start?
I'll point to two different, perhaps understudied issue areas. One is the social and economic impact of those new internet constellation that we have in low orbits. So they are offering high-speed internet at relatively low cost. It certainly has important impact for remote communities, for fisheries, for indigenous communities. In least the developed countries, I don't think we know very much what those social and economic impacts are currently. And another point is access to data collected by Earth observation satellites. So those satellites can monitor, for example, deforestation, methane emissions, illegal fisheries. Who has access to this very precious information and how? Several of those satellites are privately owned. This raised questions related to intellectual property and public goods. And I don't think there's sufficient discussion around this particular issue.
Anything to add, Cynthia, from your point of view?
I think Jeff touched a lot of the main issues. The first one for me that comes out, and that was largely the first thing mentioned by interviews when we asked them what were the gaps about space governance. It was the regulations around mega constellations. And then there's all the impacts around that. Someone told us that you could launch your laundry machine in space and no one could really do anything about it. There's a lot of questions about the proliferation of objects. And as Jeff mentioned, there's a rising but still very quiet and very new agenda on understanding the environmental impacts of re-entry of all those satellites, considering that they're by the thousands every year. And the light pollution. So a lot of the things that Jeff mentioned, it all cuts with the mega constellation. So I think that's definitely something that there's a lot of work to do there. And good Jeff is going to do a lot of that.
Indeed. I think this is a super interesting area, but also very underexplored. So thank you again, Jeff and Cynthia. We have learned so much from this conversation. And now I think we have to start studying these important questions. So I hope Jeff can also publish more studies in these areas in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.